Coming to you from the shores of gorgeous Lake Michigan, this is home to passionate book lovers everywhere. Hosting more than 260 acclaimed authors in 14 years, including best-selling novelists Geraldine Brooks, Ann Patchett, and Mitch Albom. We're live at the historic City Opera House in downtown Traverse City, Michigan. Welcome to the National Writers Series. Tonight, a conversation with Jane Smiley, Pulitzer Prize-winning author of 1,000 Acres, presenting her new novel, Lucky, with guest host Anne Marie Oman, an esteemed author in her own right and creative writing instructor. The National Writers Series couldn't do this without our amazing audience, dedicated volunteers, and talented authors.
I love NWS!
We are also raising writers with Battle of the Books and free creative writing classes to 3rd and 12th grade students across the region.
Thank you, NWS!
Tonight's event is presented to you by the Diana Mylock Historical Fiction Author Conversations. A special thanks to our media partners, Interlochen Public Radio and the Traverse City Record Eagle. And to our ongoing sponsors, the Green Brick Foundation, Northgard Technology, Northwest Michigan Arts and Culture Network, West Shore Bank, Traverse City Tourism, and Cherry Capital Airport. And now, NWS co-founder and #1 New York Times bestselling author, Doug Stanton, and NWS co-founder and executive director, Ann Stanton, will introduce tonight's event.
Welcome. So glad you're here. My name is Doug Stanton, and welcome to the City Opera House by the Bay in Traverse City, Michigan, on this beautiful summer evening. We're so lucky tonight to have Jane Smiley with us on this stage. We like to think here at the City Opera House and the Writer Series that we host conversations that are like the kind you might have over the back of a train seat late at night going through a dark new country. Hear that, guys? So, it's all made possible, though, by your attention that you're giving to these authors in this conversation. It's wonderful to have you in a room where we're all together listening to the power of the story.
You know, he just skipped an entire paragraph, but it's okay. Proceeds from tonight's event, as Noelle said in the video, support our Raising Writers program, which is completely free. Your ticket proceeds, gifts, sponsorships. And I just want to thank you for that, because we impact 1,400 kids now a year, and now we give out 8 scholarships instead of 4. We're just doing it, so thank you. And before we bring Jane and Anne Marie on stage, I'd like to acknowledge that this event is taking on place on land that's been cherished and maintained for generations by the Indigenous people. And I'd like to recognize the Grand Traverse Band of Ottawa and Chippewa Indians who still reside here today. So now please join me in welcoming Jane Smiley and guest host Anne Marie Oman, a wonderful author. He forgot to, yeah.
This is what I forgot to say.
Okay,
it's a big deal. Anne Marie is the 2023-24 Michigan Author Award recipient, and that's a big deal in the state and the U.S., and she's a wonderful friend. We're so glad to have her here tonight. Please come on out.
Hello, everyone. Please join me in welcoming Jane Smiley to our stage for the National Writers Series. And from our community, we are so glad that you are here and you could come share this novel with us.
Thank you very much.
People, yes. You know, people know a lot about your books and awards, but just as a refresher, I'm going to do a quick recap here, and I have to have notes. All of these, yeah. You were awarded a Fulbright, a National Endowment for the Arts Grant, a National Book Critics Circle Award, the Heartland Award, Penn Lifetime Achievement Award, and of course, the Pulitzer for 1,000 Acres. You've written a couple dozen best-selling novels.
But I have to add one in, which is one of my favorites.
Oh, please.
Yeah, my most recent novel before this one is called A Dangerous Business, and it's a murder mystery set in Monterey in the 1850s. And that won the Association of American Historians Award for correctness. for historical accuracy. That was the actual name of it.
I'm so sorry I missed that one.
Actually, it was like getting an A. It was like, being in 8th grade and the teacher gave you your first A on your paper.
That's lovely. So you also, a couple dozen best-selling novels, Barn Blind, which are first, Greenlanders, some children's books, nonfiction. Yours would be a rich, and many would say brilliant, accumulation of literary excellence. And I hope you won't be offended if I say that I think you're a literary national treasure.
Oh, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
And we're going to start this off this time with a brief reading from Lucky, the new novel that you're all here to hear about. So we're going to do that first this time.
It's just basically the first paragraph, but I really enjoyed writing this paragraph. When I was 6 and my uncle was 24, he did something you can't do anymore. He took me to a racetrack across the river called Cahokia Downs. That was where I saw horses for the first time. It was 1955. We didn't have a television set, so I never watched Roy Rogers or My Friend Flicka. I had no idea why we were there or what we were supposed to do, but Uncle Drew held my hand, bought me an ice cream cone, walked around when the horses were being mounted, and shouted when they were running. After we'd been there a while, he handed me a piece of paper and a pencil and told me to circle some numbers. I circled 4, then 2, then 8. He then handed the paper to a man behind a window along with $6. He later told me it was his last $6, but I never believed that. He got another piece of paper back and we went to our seats. We sat quietly, jumped up and down for the race, and then he grabbed my hand and took me back to the window. He handed in the piece of paper and the man counted out his winnings, $5,986, all in 20s and $2 bills. My uncle was grinning from ear to ear. We walked around for a long time. Then we went to the parking lot. Just before we got into the car, he squatted down and put his hands on my shoulders. He said, "Don't tell anyone we have been here or where you got this money. Hide it, save it, and buy something nice someday." He put a folded green pile in my hand. I stuck it in my pocket. And when we got home just before dinner, I went to my room and shoved it under the mattress. A month later, I remembered it, pulled it out, and counted it. It was 43 $2 bills, the $86 that I later realized would tell everyone where we had been and how he had gotten the money. The reason I waited so long was that the day after we went to the races, a Sunday afternoon, my uncle walked in the front door with a puppy, a Cocker Spaniel. He said it was a present for me because he knew I wanted a dog, and I did.
Thank you.
I wish that was autobiographical, but it isn't.
Well, we're going to talk about that. But first, let's find a little bit about you. You were born in California, but you moved to St. Louis as an infant. So your childhood and your youth is St. Louis.
Yes.
And I I see there's this parallel in Lucky. You're writing this book, and St. Louis is everywhere. Jodie Rattler, the voice that you all just heard, is your fictional representative, sort of, but she is seeing St. Louis, and in some ways, this feels like a love letter to St. Louis. And I just wonder if you can talk about your youth a little bit and the role of St. Louis in your life.
Well, my grandparents had a house in Webster Groves on a block, Clark Avenue. And it was really a great place to grow up because there were a lot of other kids in the neighborhood. The school was about a block and a half away. Downtown in Webster, and a couple of times my cousin Jody, the bad boy, he sneaked me over there. It was Old Orchard, where there were a lot of places to buy food and look for, and also the public library. And my mom worked for the St. Louis Globe-Democrat, and she couldn't afford much, but she rented a house on a small street not far from my grandparents. And one of the great things about Webster is that, and also I should say, we had cousins that were related to my grandfather who lived in the fanciest part of Webster. So one of the great things about Webster was it was safe to walk around if you're a kid, but there was so many things to see. And one of the things you always saw was the people who were just regular working class people like you, and then the people who were really rich, and then the people who were really down on their luck and lived in shacks. And I think that was a real educational experience for me. I enjoyed my school, which was called Avery School. And then my mom remarried and we moved to Ladue, and I went to a really good high school there called John Burroughs, where I really learned a lot. And so, I just thought St. Louis was a interesting and welcoming place. There were so many good restaurants to go to also, that I'm really glad that I grew up there.
Yeah. As I was reading Lucky, I was thinking about the place names that are, it's just inundated. You want to talk a little bit about the place names? Because
well, that was one of my favorite parts, was that there are so many odd street names. And when I was back in St. Louis for my 50th high school reunion, we stayed at a hotel called the Cheshire Inn. And I was walking in Forest Park, and I noticed that there was this beautiful, beautiful house, and it was on this road named Skinker. And that made me laugh. And then when I thought of doing this book about Jodie, I thought, oh, that's where she lives. She lives on Skinker. But, the street up the hill from my grandparents' house was called Bompart, and there were so many odd place names. There's a town where a lot of wealthy people called Creve Coeur, and why would you name a town Broken Heart? I just was fascinated.
But it makes it's a kind of rhythm in the language too.
Well, I think that's true.
Yeah, that there's these hard names and soft names, and they're all unusual because we don't have meaning for them, but they are bouncing around in the language.
Yeah, I really like that aspect. Yeah. And so when I was driving around St. Louis trying to figure out where Jodie was going to live and what she was going to do in ways that were different from my life, I tried to include as many weird street names as I could.
So I understand that you're...
I forgot to mention Litzinger.
There you go, Litzinger. Let's not forget. Your father was a player, or he worked with the Municipal Theater Association, which is...
No, that was my stepfather.
Your stepfather, yes,
yeah.
Thank you. And that's an incredible open-air venue in Forest Park. And your mother worked as a newspaper person, right?
Mm-hmm. She was the editor of the women's page for the St. Louis Globe-Democrat.
So I'm just curious about how those particular careers affected your thinking or your leaning toward writing, or was it a literary
Well, I
sort
would
of
say
background?
that my mother always wanted to be a writer. She wrote all the way until she died. She wrote poetry, she wrote stories, and she worked for this newspaper. And there was always a typewriter on the table in our little house.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was growing up and wanted to learn to read, she didn't care if I had a flashlight and read under the covers of my bed. I thought I was doing it in secret, but she knew I was doing it. And, I think I was about 7 or 8 when the World Book salesman came by and sold her a World Book encyclopedia, so I read that a lot. She didn't say I had to read this or I had to read that. If I wanted to read the Bobbsey Twins, that was fine with her. And so she loved literature, she loved reading, she loved any kind of writing. And so she didn't tell me to do it, but she didn't stop me from doing it. And I think that was a good thing. And then also in our family, I spent a lot of time with my grandparents because they lived right near my school. And in our family, one of the big things that everybody liked to do was tell stories about things that had happened in the past. They told them to us kids, but they told them as if they were funny, even if something bad had happened. And but my favorite part of that was, so you'd be in the living room and grandmother would tell a part of a story and grandfather would finish it. And then you'd go into the kitchen for a drink of water and one of the aunts would come in and say, now that's not what happened. Here's what really happened. And to me, as a writer, as a novelist, I think that's totally essential because what it does is it tells you that each of these people has a different point of view and a different idea about what's true and what's right. And I think that was a really good reason for me to get interested in books because novels were the same.
Were you ever drawn to the theater?
No.
No. So that part never stuck. Yeah.
No, I was not drawn to the theater at all.
It's the storytelling.
I liked the storytelling and I liked reading plays. Mm-hmm. But I think for me, literature was a private thing. And I wanted to read it and interpret it on my own and in my own way.
Sure, yeah. So you also you've mentioned you went to John Burroughs School.
Yeah.
And it's a fine private school in St. Louis. And so does your hero, or your
Yes.
main character, Jodie Rattler. And I'm curious about that autobiographical parallel. What did you want to sort of place on Jodie Rattler's personality, her character, that you were taking from John Burroughs?
Well, John Burroughs was a great place to learn. And it wasn't just that I learned to read books. I also learned a lot of other stuff. We had a great music department. And I was in the junior chorus and I was in the senior chorus. And for me, that was a way of watching these other students who actually had a voice and could sing and contemplating what their lives were like. Our class was small. It had 68 students in the class. And so that was enough students so that there was a lot of variety, but it was also not so many. You felt like you got to know a lot of them, even if you weren't intimate with them, just by being around them for 6 years.
Sure.
And to me, that was always fascinating. Okay, this one is the cutest guy. Why does he misbehave all the time, for example?
Teachers ask that all the time, too.
Yeah.
So your Jodie goes to summer camp in several places, but one of the places she goes to is Interlochen Summer
Yes.
Camp, which is right down the road.
Yes.
And you did as well.
No, I did not. I went to Clearwater Camp.
You went to Clearwater.
In Minocqua, Wisconsin. No, I needed her to go to a camp where she could learn stuff about music. And so I just looked it up. And I decided it was here.
This is how it works.
So what I wanted for Jodie was to have a life that sort of ran parallel to mine but wasn't like mine. And I wanted her to have loves and what's the word I'm looking for, and desires and talents that would run parallel to mine but weren't mine. And it was a kind of a what-if sort of situation.
Were you thinking, did you ever think you wanted to go into music? Did you ever?
I loved music, and I still do. I really love music, and I sing a lot when I'm walking around in the park. But I was terrible at practicing, and so I would go to the lessons, and I would do the best I could, but I couldn't make myself practice. But I still love music a lot.
That's evident. So you've already said, this is so many parallels to your life. Is this, I'm curious, you've got the childhood, the youth, the St. Louis roots, all running alongside, and also world travel, and I'm just wondering, is this kind of a rogue autofiction?
Yes.
Can you talk about that?
One of the things that I really enjoyed about writing this book was having Jodie cross my path from time to time. And for some readers, it takes a while for them to realize that the girl she refers to as the gawky girl is me. And so there are a few things in the book that are observations of me from afar. Mm-hmm. And that was fun for me.
I really loved the gawky girl. It took me a minute to figure out why she was so present, and I was thinking, there's something here. And then later, I don't know, there are a couple of hints. She's written a novel, and you run into her in a faraway place, and I realized that you're her, And I'm curious about why put an author in a piece of fiction, except it's rogue autofiction,
Yeah, well, the answer to that is you'd have to read the book to find out.
Smart answer.
Because there is a little bit of a surprise ending.
There is indeed.
And, but it also, I just wanted the thread of her life to just be not always far away from me. I wanted it to be parallel but different. Mm-hmm. And for example, she never gets married. She never has kids. Mm-hmm. And she's much more daring and exploratory in her love life than I was. And that was really fun for me, to pretend or to imagine what it would be like to just have, I can't even remember how many she has, but to have all the lovers that she has and what she learns about humans and life from having all these different lovers. And so that was a really fun part for me.
It's a fun part for the reader, too.
Good.
So there's... it's a tribute in many ways to the music of the boomer generation.
Yeah.
And really so many songs that I remembered. What made you interested in, there could have been any number of ways you could have paralleled Jodie's life, but you parallel it through this particular strand of music. What made you want to revisit that part of our culture?
Well, I really love music. Mm-hmm. And one of the first things that my mom bought when I was, it was in that apartment, so I would have been about 5 or 6, was a record player, the old kind that you put a whole stack of records on the record player. And so she played music all the time on the record player. And she played My Fair Lady, the soundtrack to My Fair Lady, so many times that I still have it entirely memorized. And she loved music, and then when I got to be in when I got to be in junior high and then high school, I had my own record player and I listened to music, and that was the music I listened to. I mean, yes, I was a crazy Beatles fan and I loved George the best.
Paul.
But what I really loved to listen to was folk music. Judy Collins, Joni Mitchell, that kind of singing. And if I had been a musician, that's what I would have done, was be that kind of a musician, not a classical musician. Because there was something enlightening and easy to listen to and knowledgeable about artists, especially like Tom Rush and various other artists. And so I gave Jodie those records too.
And so many of them are narrative as well.
Yes,
yeah,
that's
and
true.
So there's a story base in so many of them. Yeah. One of my favorite sections of the book is the section that takes place in Britain, and where she's going supposedly to study the British folk ballads, and that's another strand of the music. Was the British sort of those people, those musicians, were they part of your listening as a child?
Yes, I loved any kind of English music. My mom loved England. That was her favorite place. She would have said that she would have lifted her nose and said, I actually prefer Paris. But no, she didn't. She really loved England. But so I liked, when I got interested in music, I liked all those ballads that had been written in the British ballads, and I really liked those.
Okay. So there's and I don't think it's too much of a spoiler here, and I'm a little bit of a romantic myself, but there's a person she meets while she's there, Jodie, and it's the love of her life.
Yes.
And to have her meet, while she's trying to study all these romantic ballads, I think that's a pretty cool thing. But she ends up abandoning that love or leaving it quite deliberately.
Yes.
And I'm just curious, you've created a character who has the will to do that in a time when women were not yet learning to do that, to place their art first and to be independent.
Well,
Can you talk about that?
The other thing is that her own mother had a lot of misadventures in her sex life. So if we imagine her mother as being born in, say, 1920 or 22, and her mother wanting to find that ultimate guy, she can never do it. And I think that that's a reason that Jodie is not used to family life. And she really she understands, when she's doing this, when she's in England, it's the early 1970s, she understands that she has to make a choice between her singing career and some kind of family life. And she doesn't want to give up what she's done already. And so she decides she can't do that. There's another reason too, but you'd have to read the book to find out what that is.
But I love the fact that she has this sense of independence, and she makes it a choice. It's not an expectation. It's not something she just walks into. She makes it a choice. Really interesting character that way.
But for me, that's what creativity is about. When you're in the habit of writing books or writing songs, you understand that you are the person who's making the choices. And yes, your editor has her ideas too, but you were the one who came up with the idea. You were the one who thought it through. You were the one who went over it a lot of different times. And that gives you a sense of independence. And so I think women who are who write songs or paint or write books or write poetry, they understand what they want to do and also themselves better than ones who have, no matter, even if you're a lawyer and you have a really good job, you still are constantly aware that you have to do this and you have to do this, and other people have all these opinions about you. But the first person, if you're a writer, the first person you want to please is yourself, and you get used to that.
Yeah, that's interesting. So that's a nice segue, though. You, for this novel, Jodie writes many lyrics
Yes.
to songs, which means you wrote many lyrics
Yes,
to
I did,
songs.
yeah.
And I just wondered, has anyone ever offered to put them to music?
Not so far.
Not so far. Musicians out there? I was fascinated by this because I really felt some of them were really good. And I'm just wondering.
I enjoyed writing them for sure, yeah.
Yeah. Would you mind reading a page
Not at
of
all.
them? This is a treat.
So another place that she goes is also a place I went to often and loved, and that's the Catskills. And so I'm going to read a paragraph about the song, and then I'm going to read the song. The song was inspired by my love of the Catskills, but it couldn't just be about some pretty landscape. All songs in the 80s, and maybe forever, had to have some drama. I didn't want to write a murder ballad, so I was stuck with writing a left behind ballad. There was a farm just north of Roxbury that I thought was in the most beautiful spot in the world, up a slight slope, not a cliff, from a branch of the Delaware River with the majestic wooded hills in every direction. I often looked at it as I drove by, and that was where I set the song. It was titled, You Knew. You knew I married you and not the farm. I thought I would lure you back someday to the busy street where we learned to play that little game we loved. Let's go, let's stay. But when I saw the lovely trees, the clouds fluttering in the breeze, when I walked in through the door, saw the knots on the piney floor, and smelled the billowing wind, I wanted to stay and never to go. We planted the beans, we planted the thyme, we deepened the well and enjoyed the grime. It was you who got restless and eager to go. Back to noise and life on the go. I grabbed your hand, took you up the hill. I looked into the distance, but you got a chill. Then you were gone, and you never returned. Life on the farm is deathly quiet. The house is empty, as if it had burned. With my ashes inside it, drifting on the air. I can't leave. I won't leave this beautiful place, but nothing fills up your empty space. Do you see me down the street looking your way? Do you hold out your hand or run away? And then do you turn, and it's me who is gone back to the farm, to the sun at dawn, glowing with love, perfect in the sky, giving me beauty till the day I die. Well, anyone who wants to volunteer to make up the tune, please do.
I think it's nearly there. It's beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. Maybe a little side fluff here. I have a couple of novel friends who are who have playlists while they're writing.
Huh.
Do you ever do that?
I like it to be quiet,
Yeah.
but I have playlists when I drive the car.
Sure.
I love to listen to music.
Do you
in the car.
do you think you're writing issues?
Sometimes.
Yeah.
Sometimes.
Yeah.
Mostly I think about my writing issues when I'm walking.
Yeah.
And I don't put anything in my ear when I'm walking. I want to hear what I'm seeing, and I want to hear the birds, and I want to just hear everything.
You know, that's a question that I think is relevant because so many people talk about the relationship between writers and walking, and there's this literary thread starting, I mean, with Thoreau maybe, with the, you know, do you consider yourself a practicing literary walker?
Well, you know, I've been walking my whole life.
Yeah, we all have.
You know, because I lived in this town in Webster Groves, we just walked. Nobody stopped us, and we got as far as we could, and then we turned around, and fortunately I never get lost. I never got lost then. I get lost now a lot, but I never forget when my cousin, who still lives in St. Louis, he lives in Kirkwood, walked with me up to the train tracks, and he told me I had to stand 6 inches away from the tracks, otherwise if a train went by, I would be swept under. And then I was told later on that it was a commuter train. It was coming to the station. It wouldn't have swept me under. But yeah, he was a great walker. I love to walk around St. Louis, and I always have. And I love looking at the trees. I love listening to the birds, seeing the birds. And I have to admit this, I always do, that I love eavesdropping on the people that I'm passing. Because, you know, in my experience, I get ideas from what I see and what I hear. And it's a good way to just keep your mind moving.
Thank you. I also like to walk.
Good.
So, just to continue with the music question for a minute, you mentioned the 4 J's, and there are others as well. Many of those musicians who made the big splash, the really big fame, did not end well. Their lives were not. They were complicated.
Well, obviously that's true of Janis, who was one of the J's.
Mm-hmm. But some of the others, there were other artists.
Well, Judy's still going.
Right.
Joan Baez is still going.
Right, but I'm thinking of some of the other, Jimi Hendrix and some of the other, in that same era, who are not part of the 4 J's, but who are leaders in that rock and roll scene. And you've created a Jodie who keeps her head through all of that, and she has a certain amount of luck. And I'm just curious about that. If you're making a commentary on success, or by having her under the radar rather than the blazing light.
Well, one of the differences between the writing life and the singing life is that the writing life is more private. And most writers don't become these huge public figures that are pestered all the time by their fans. And the singing life can go either direction. And I wanted Jodie's singing life to be a pleasure for her, but to not be a trial for her. And so I thought about, okay, what sort of things would she get to do that she would enjoy? And what sort of things does she not have to put up with that other singers at the same time did have to put up with? I mean, the town where I lived, Carmel Valley, California, Joan Baez lived there for a while. And I can totally see why, because life is very private and simple in Carmel Valley. And I think she's a good example of a singer who figured out how to construct her life so that she could do it her way rather than being at the mercy of her fans.
So that becomes an example of how to manage that. Yeah. And that's part of the luck, too, for Jodie.
Yeah, I would say so.
Yeah, I think so.
I mean, one of my favorite parts of this book is where it's the part where she's now in her 30s, I think, and or maybe slightly older, and she realizes that she spent her whole life being too reserved, and that she really
I love that scene.
doesn't connect with anybody. And so she has to figure out a way to learn how to sort of open up. And that was quite a pleasure for me to write. And I'm not going to say I was the same way, but maybe I was in some ways.
Well, that was one of the questions that I was thinking about, is that particular scene in the Roxbury cabin where she suddenly realizes she's alone, and that becomes a pivot point for her.
Well, that's the dilemma. If you decide you're going to remain a single woman, which is what she does. Mm-hmm. So the dilemma is, how do you, especially if you're something of an introvert, which she is. So the dilemma is, how do you sort of open up a little bit and have more friends and connect more? And that was a part of the book that I liked a lot.
Yeah. So she's an incredibly disciplined musician. You know,
Yeah.
she practices every day, even when she's
way better than
not.
I was.
But I wonder if there isn't a parallel to your writing process. I mean, you write every day? Do you,
Yes.
as she did?
Yes.
Can you talk about that process a little bit?
Well, I write in the morning because I can't think of a damn thing in the afternoon. And I learned that years ago. Mm-hmm. I don't know, when I was just starting out, I realized that I had it together more in the morning than in the afternoon. So I write in the morning every day, usually for about an hour and a half to 2 hours. And let's see, what's the word I'm looking for? I power my writing with a Diet Coke, which I've been doing since the mid-'80s.
So you're not a coffee drinker?
No, I'm not a coffee drinker. And so I write between, say, 1,000 words, and as I continue in a book, I get more and more words, because I know what I'm doing more. When I start out, it's about 1,000 words, and I'm sort of scratching my head. But then it all sort of comes together, and I go faster. With the Greenlanders, I might have said this before, but I started out with the Greenlanders, and I didn't have any idea what I was doing. I wanted the novel to be written in a very archaic style, and I just did the best I could, and then I fixed it, and then I fixed it, and then I fixed it. And then once the style got into my head, it just sort of went, shoo. The whole novel just went out. And also, the interesting thing to me was that I was using a computer for the first time. It was a portable K-Pro. And I don't know why they called it portable, since it was heavy as a sewing machine. But that meant that I wasn't taking the paper out of the typewriter, and therefore I wasn't pausing. So as I got toward the end of the Greenlanders, I would get up after thinking I'd been writing for about an hour and a half, and I'd realize I'd been writing for 5 hours. And I would think I'd written 4 pages, and I'd realize I'd written about 15 or 20.
That's remarkable, but that is a big book.
And that's what happens with your imagination. Once it all clicks and comes together, then you just keep thinking and going. You just keep thinking and going. And so that's sort of been my style all along. I start with something, I have no idea what I'm doing. I work on it and work on it and work on it, and then the ideas come together, and then it sort of flows out.
When do you do the research? I mean, that book had immense research behind it.
Well, one of the great things was that when I was in graduate school at the University of Iowa, we read the Icelandic sagas, and I adored them. And that's why I wanted to write one about the end of the Greenland colony, because there was one about the founding of the Greenland colony, and it was called Greenland Saga. But I was fascinated by what happened. Where did they go? During the Middle Ages, the difference between Iceland and Greenland was that Greenland was much more prosperous, and the people in Greenland were taller and stronger because they had access to so much protein from sea life, like porpoises and stuff, more so than the Icelanders did. And they lived on the west side of Greenland. There's so many interesting stories about them, and I'll tell one in a second. But they lived on the western side of Greenland. The climate was good because of the medieval warm period. And then they were gone. And I just had to write about it. I couldn't stop myself. But I also knew that I had to practice with other books. I had to practice learning how to write a novel in order to write that one. But it was my goal to write that one. But then my other big goal was, because I'd read so much Shakespeare in high school and college, and I saw all of the different types of drama and I call him Uncle Bill, that Uncle Bill wrote, I said, okay, if Uncle Bill can write a comedy, a tragedy, an epic, and, well, the epic was based on the Icelandic sagas, and a romance, well, why not? I'll try it. And so I tried them. So the epic was The Greenlanders, the tragedy was 1,000 Acres, the comedy was Moo, and the romance was The All True Travels and Adventures of Liddy Newton. And then I got interested in racehorses, and boom, I said, okay, there has to be a novel about horse racing, and there has to be a comic horse, a tragic horse, an epic horse, a romantic horse, but also a realistic horse, and a surrealistic horse. And that was a lot of fun too. But, Uncle Bill made me do it, sorry.
Uncle Bill, I love it. So I want to go back to that idea of luck, because that's what's really, it's a title, and she starts out with this talisman, these 43 $2 bills that she carries with her whole life. And I'm thinking about luck, and is she lucky because she has those, or does her attitude toward life simply reflect, does she bring that to her? Does luck make her, or?
I think both. Mm-hmm. She understands that various people who are coming to her life, like her Uncle Drew, for example, that these people are uniquely kind, and as far as he's concerned, he's uniquely well-to-do, and yet a very kind and decent person. And various other people come into her life too, and they show her the things that she's glad to have missed, and also the things that she's glad to have achieved. And that's just how she thinks. And I feel the same way. I feel like I've been really lucky in everything, in the 4 husbands who are all total sweethearts, and I'm on good terms with all of them, And one of my great pieces of luck was that I was with my current husband and my ex-husband who dumped me for the dental hygienist, who then dumped him because she realized he wasn't as rich as she thought he was. But he ended up having a good marriage with a fellow musician, and they have a great life together. And one time he was at our house having dinner, and I was able to say, the best thing that ever happened to me in my whole life was when you dumped me.
I have to ask, what was his response?
He nodded.
He nodded?
He knows that's true, and we still are really good friends, and we have a son, and
That's
he's a
remarkable.
good dad, and yeah, I think our son actually was lucky too, because when I married my current husband, his son was about 4 years older than my son, and so suddenly my son had a sweetheart of an older brother who has been a really good older boy companion to him all these years. And so that was just another piece of luck.
Nice.
So yeah, so I have to say, you know, if I ever have an autobiographer or a biographer, not an autobiographer, but if I ever have a biographer, I want that person to understand that I lucked out. I mean, look at me, I'm 6'2". What could be lucky about that, except that it really is lucky, you know? About a year ago, I told my husband to take a picture of me standing in front of my horse with my legs apart and my hands on my hips. And I said, I want you to take a don't fuck with me picture. And one of the great aspects of being 6'2" is people don't know if you're a woman or a man some of the time. And these days, you know, it doesn't even matter how long your hair is, because there are a lot of guys with really long hair. And so they don't fuck with you, you know?
Nice. So
I have to say, I owe my height to the state of Michigan. Because my father, who was 6'4", was from Michigan. He was from Grand Rapids. And he came from a long line of Michigan people.
and tall people.
And tall people, yeah.
Well, I'd like to see that photograph at some point. So there's also the question of money in the novel. Mm-hmm. And Jodie has this benevolent Uncle Drew who takes her first earnings, invests them wisely. And so through her lifetime, this nest egg grows. So she has, I was thinking about this in terms of Virginia Woolf and the essay, A Room of One's Own, and how she says, we all remember that she says the writer has to have a room of one's own, but she also says the writer has to have a minimum income and to rely on so that she can do her art. And there are so many, you're showing us a character who essentially has both of those things.
Well, yes, she, and that's another piece of luck for her. Mm-hmm. But that's also another clue to the surprise ending.
Yes.
You know, I had some friends of mine read the book who were musicians, and the first thing they said was, well, we like it, but nobody earns that kind of money for their music. And I said, that's the clue. That's the clue. So I'm not going to say any more about that.
I do wonder also if underneath that there isn't some commentary that you're making about how we monetize everything. You know, that music is monetized, our joy is monetized, and what happens if we provided artists with something more stable?
Well, you know, I have to say, okay, for me, the big piece of luck was to win the Pulitzer for 1,000 Acres, because once that happened, my advances for books got larger. Mm-hmm. And so I was able to, you know, invest some money and get along. I didn't have to go basically from book to book. I had something behind me, so that I could send the kids to the schools they wanted. I could, oh my God, buy horses.
You have written so much about those horses. Can you, what is it in them? How did you find the horse theme and you just pursued that with such a vocation?
Well, I grew up, I really adored horses when I was a kid, and I did have a couple of horses when I was in my junior high school. And then I came back to it, actually, if you can imagine this, in northern Wisconsin. So we lived in Iowa, and the summer, I think it was the summer of 87 or 8, and it was incredibly hot. And so my husband and I drove up to northern Wisconsin just to get away from the heat. And we had some money, and we ended up buying a place on the Lac du Flambeau Indian Reservation. And so we bought that place. And then one day, when my son was about 9 months old, I was just driving around looking for one of those people who sold toys from her house. And I saw this sign that said, riding stable this way. And I thought, in northern Wisconsin, are you kidding me? But I couldn't resist, so I went there. And it was a couple who had come up from Chicago to northern Wisconsin, to Monaco, Wisconsin. And I was watching the guy, George, his name was, give a lesson. And I said, I should go back and I should do this again. I really loved it when I did it. And so I said, can you give me some lessons? And he said, sure. And I had my son, my 9-month-old son, on my hip, and I stepped forward, and his toe touched the electric fence, and he cried out. And I said, I should have taken that as a warning, but I didn't. Anyway, I came back for a lesson, and I think either the first lesson or the second lesson, he put me on this 17-hand gray thoroughbred from the racetrack, or off the racetrack. And I sensed, even though I didn't have any skills as a rider then anymore, I sensed this horse was adorable, and I bought him. And that was the horse that became the reason that I started writing books about horses. That was Mr. T. Mr. T. And so I took him back to Iowa and rode him a lot, rode him every day just about. And I said, okay, I love him. I love horses. I got to get back into this.
So, and you have several, and you were also interested in horse racing.
Yeah, that was a bad girl thing to do.
Oh, tell us about the bad girl.
Well, Mr. T, so Mr. T, I looked him up on the racing, what is it called? It has all the pedigrees and the racing class stats and all that. And I saw that he had this tattoo under his lip. And I thought, oh, he must have been a racehorse. And I looked him up after I had read the tattoo, and it turned out that he had had 52 starts and won about $140,000 over the years. But more importantly, he had been bred in France, born in Germany, raced in New York, raced in Chicago. And I thought, wow, this is the most, I don't know, well-traveled being I've ever known, you know. And I thought, well, if he could do it, why not do some breeding? And it was a bad idea, but it was fun.
We've all gone down some of those routes.
Yeah, but he was a total sweetheart. I loved him, and he was very kind, and he was a great horse to ride.
So just to bring it back to Lucky for a minute here, you know, it's a walk down memory lane for those of us of a certain age. And even for younger people, there are so many resurrected hits there that have come back that are so beautiful and energetic. But there's a point in the novel where, you know, she has, even though many of those songs were politically based in that time, Jodie is not a political activist particularly.
Not in particular, no.
But in later years, she does become more politically active in the story.
Well, one of the things she realizes is that she has a lot of money. And she has to figure out a way to use it in a helpful way. And so she sets up various accounts where she can contribute to, political things and
good causes.
And good causes, yeah.
Right. And I'm just wondering if that wasn't also, maybe I'm trying to read a little bit of a deeper message in here because I so enjoyed it, that there's also a kind of message for the times,
Well, I hope so.
Yeah.
I mean, she has to live in the world that we live in. Mm-hmm. And I want her to live in that world. And I want her to be a good citizen in that world. Mm-hmm. Not a selfish person.
Okay. I think that's remarkable because I think that is a success, that she is one of those people who actually has luck, but she uses it well.
Good, I'm glad you think so.
Yeah, and I think that's maybe a wonderful time to...
I became very fond of her. If you have a long life as a novelist, you have characters that you never want to see again. And you have characters that you can't stop writing about and you wish they'd walk in the door. And that's just the way it is.
I just have to ask about one, the all true tales of Liddy Newton. I heard there might be a sequel.
There is a sequel.
Yes.
It's coming out in about 2 years. And that was one of my favorite books. That book takes place in the 1850s troubles in Kansas. Mm-hmm. Now, I have to say, as a girl from Missouri, we never looked at Kansas City. It was way beneath us. We looked at Chicago. But so in I guess it was around the time of the Oklahoma bombing, I was in Washington, D.C. with one of my daughters, and I called her dad, who was living in Iowa, to tell him that as far as I could see, there was no dangers in Washington, D.C. But he specialized in American history, especially of the Midwest. And I said, I have to write about violence in American history. What do you suggest? And the first word that came out of his mouth was Kansas. And the more I looked it up, the more I said, I got to write about this. Mm-hmm. And so that was the inspiration for Liddy Newton.
Well, I can't wait to read the sequel, but I'm so thrilled to have talked with you about Lucky because I think it's an unusual book in that it is about good luck. Good. And it's about positive ways of living. I think that's remarkable in a time when we're doom scrolling,
Yeah, I mean, I have to say that I can't go back to that life of writing books that are cruel.
Yeah.
I wish, those are the ones that sell, actually, but I can't do it. Mm-hmm. I can't do it at my age.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
I think we are at a point where we could take some questions from the audience.
And I love questions. So somebody's got it. I don't care what it is, just ask it.
So if you have a question, if you could make your way, as this gentleman is here, to the microphones, and I think that we'll go here and then over here if you want to line up that way. And then we'll try to take one from the balcony also. So go ahead, sir.
Could you expand on the idea that cruelty sells?
On what?
That cruelty sells.
A little closer to the mic, sir.
Well, that's the perfect example of that is the murder mystery. Agatha Christie and a lot of the murder mystery writers, they're the ones who make money. And I think that it's because people are curious about bad things that happen, even if the bad things never happen to them. And obviously, we grow up with fears. And so one of the ways that we resolve those fears is to read about them, and then if you become an author, you write about them. And the great thing about, say, Sherlock Holmes and Agatha Christie is that they make a cruel event that you can't figure out, they make it understandable. And that's what murder mysteries are for. Now, obviously, Agatha Christie is not as violent as some of the other mystery writers are, but everybody has their preference with regard to which kind of mysteries that they like. And, you know, that's just the way it is. You know, if you look at, say, the Aeneid or Ulysses, or I mean, the Odyssey, you know, bad things are happening in there. I think people have been, as long as they've been writing narratives, they've been writing them about bad things in order to try and understand them.
Uncle Bill.
Uncle Bill, definitely Uncle Bill.
How about over here?
Yes. This is a question from our virtual audience member, Susan Odgers. She says, welcome to Traverse City, Jane, from the Michigan Writers. Please talk about the current efforts that we're hearing about your books being banned.
Well, so far, the only one that's been banned is 1,000 Acres. And it's only been banned in a few places. And I think it's because there's sexual innuendo in there about why Larry is not on good terms with his 2 older daughters. And I think that's what it is. The other, there was one of the books I wrote was called 10 Days in the Hills, and it had as much sex in it as I could possibly put in it. And I wanted to get it banned because when a book is banned, then it sells better. And I was so annoyed when it didn't get banned. But you know, it's about Hollywood, so people must assume that this kind of sex stuff happens in Hollywood all the time. So what's the big deal?
I'm sorry.
But you know, a lot of the books that have been banned are books that I really love. You know, like The Color Purple. I don't understand why they're banning those books. I don't understand it.
Yeah.
But it's a way to supposedly protect children from knowing bad things that happen. And I think that's a totally bad idea.
It's not real.
It's not real.
Yeah.
They grow up thinking that life is different from the way it really is, and then they don't know how to deal with stuff.
Thank you. How about you?
You spoke a little bit about your writing process and that you sit down and write and then pull things in and pull it together. But when you were writing Some Luck trilogy, which I loved, and it was a book with so many characters over such a long time span, what was your process with that? Did you have an idea of where these characters were going? How did you manage that? I'd like to hear more about your creative process with that. And then how did you track everything? Like, what was your method for keeping track of who was who and details?
Well, that's an interesting question. So I knew that I wanted to write a trilogy that went from 1920 to 2020. I knew that I wanted to base it on a farm in Iowa because when you have enough children on a farm, they get out of town. Some do, some stay on the farm. And I thought that was a good way to observe what had been going on from 1920 to 2020. So that was my original idea. And I always do this, I made myself some rules, but the rules for every book are different. And the rules for this book the main rule for this book was that every year had an equal number of pages. So even the pages where Frank is going off to the Second World War, that has the same number of pages as where Joe is on the farm, just doing farming stuff. So I wanted it to just go through history the way we go through history, just 1 year at a time and 1 day at a time. I wanted to explore the lives of the people who got off the farm, the lives of the people who stayed on the farm. And I did my best to research as closely as possible the things that happened in all those years. Wow. And I quite enjoyed it. And one thing that happens to every author, I think, is that you come to love some characters and you come to not like some of the other characters. And I totally loved Frank's wife, Andy. And there were other characters in the book that I liked, but you know. I loved Henry. He's the son who turns out to be gay. And I loved following his life. And so, yeah, I enjoyed writing the trilogy, and I enjoyed the fact that it moved steadily rather than sort of suspensefully, because it wasn't my job in that one to be suspenseful.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. Yeah, we have I think a question up here.
Yes, I love the book, but I have a question about the parents, the mother, and the grandparents. You spent a long time in the book talking about how Jodie takes care of her grandparents as they die, and also her mother's struggles with alcoholism.
Yeah.
And you haven't commented on that big chunk of the book, and I wondered if you could give us some insights into why you chose to create these particular characters in Jodie's life.
Well, one of the things that happens is you start out in a book and you have to have certain characters in the book, like a mom, or the people who take care of the child. And they have to live their lives too. And at the beginning, you don't necessarily know what their lives are going to be like. And I did not want, I wanted therapy or whatever help to work for Jodie's mom. I didn't want Jodie's mom for her whole life to be a mess.
Another bit of luck.
Yeah.
That she can do that.
Yeah. And so I had to figure out a way. And so what happens is she meets the right people who help her, and she allows herself to change. And we all know alcoholics who allow themselves to change and other alcoholics who don't. And so that was a topic that I wanted to explore. And so you mentioned her mother. Oh, and the grandparents. Well, the grandparents are a little bit based on my grandparents, but just a little bit. And my grandmother was absolutely sharp mentally to the end of her life, and she lived to be 97 and a half. But her problem, she had problems, and she couldn't hear, she couldn't see. She had a lot of arthritis, so her whole life, which was built around making things, she couldn't do that anymore either. And so when she was about 95, she got pneumonia, and she was rushed off to the hospital by my aunts. And when she sort of came to again, she was livid. She said, "Don't you realize pneumonia is the old woman's friend?" And that made me want to explore old age. But I didn't want it to be like my family, so I decided to switch them and make the mother the one who has the dementia, and the grandfather the one who keeps it together for years and years and years.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. Do we have another one down here? Or over here. Sorry, Noel.
Yeah, that's all right. This is another question from the live stream audience. What advice do you have for aspiring novelists?
Go straight to the bookstore and buy a copy of 13 Ways of Looking at the Novel, which is, sorry, self-promotion. But that's a book I wrote about novels, about reading them and writing them. And there's 2 chapters in it. What I did was, around the time of 9/11, I think a lot of writers looked at their work and said, this is pointless. And so I decided to read a bunch of novels to just distract myself. And I went all the way back to the Tale of Genji. And I came to about 2000, I think it was. And so I read all these novels, and I learned so much from reading them. And one of the things that I learned was that every novelist, or almost every novelist, had all kinds of things to deal with that were taking place at the time when they were alive. And but I learned a lot about the nature of the novel, and that's why I wrote 13 Ways of Looking at the Novel. And so there's a novel of your own part 1, a novel of your own part 2. And those give advice about the first draft and then subsequent drafts. And but if I'm going to say the one little piece of advice I would say it's just stick with it. Stick with it until you think that you've made it work. Because the main person you have to please is yourself. Yeah, you want to get it published. Yeah, you want your friends to like it. But the main person you have to please is yourself.
Thank you. Yes, good advice. One more here.
So this is a follow-up on your comments about your characters that you like or don't like or that stay with you. As a writer, do you find that you've been surprised by your own characters in the process of writing?
Absolutely. Yeah, I can't even, I can't say which ones at this point. But I have had that experience where I thought a character was going to be just a side character, and then they just sort of inserted themselves. But to me, that's the essential writing experience. You write every day, and you always come to the point where you say, geez, I don't know what's next, what am I gonna do? And then you look around and you say, oh, okay, there's a bird up there. I'm gonna just put that bird in here because I can't think of anything else. And so you put the bird in there. And the result is that the bird, or whatever it is either a pebble or a seed. If it's a pebble, it's just holding space. And it's something you put in there, it pushes the narrative a little farther. But if you come back to it the next day or the day after that, and it gives you another idea, then it's a seed. And you think, oh, that's an idea, and you keep going. But you have to be open to that kind of writing. You have to have a plan, but also be open to something that might change your plan and give you something more interesting.
Jane, that's a remarkable sort of recap of the process, and I think it's so true for those of you who are trying to write. I just want to say thank you so much for this conversation. It's been rich and fun and delightful, and you've startled me, and I've loved the answers, and thank you for being such a fine guest.
Thank you.
Really appreciate
Thank you for
it.
having me. And thank you all. Thank you all for coming, because every writer knows or has had the experience of going to give a reading and there's only one person there. So it's a great pleasure to have a nice audience, and I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Coming to you from the shores of gorgeous Lake Michigan, this.
And she will
Thank
be
you for joining
available to
us.
sign
Up
books
next
in the
is
lobby
iconic
if you want to have
nonfiction
them
writer
inscribed.
Eric Larson
All
on
right?
Thursday,
Thank
July
you so
11th.
much.
He'll present his new book, The Demon of Unrest. Get tickets at nationalwriterseries.org.